Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in.
Okay, happy Sunday everybody. This week, Logan Wright, partner at Rhodium Group, leading the firm's China markets research work and senior associate of the trustee chair in Chinese business and economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, published a very long report called China's Economy Has Peaked. Can Beijing Redefine Its Goals? Wright is one of the most respected voices in the US on China's financial and economic system, and this piece is a fascinating and provocative look at the structural issues and policy choices facing Beijing and the world. The article also does an excellent job at distilling and summarizing the many themes on the economy we've been following on this channel for many months now. It's a Sunday, so on occasion I like to do something a little different for the core China Update audience that watches on the weekend. For today, I wanted to examine some of Wright's piece. These are his ideas on the topics, and I'd very much like to know what you think of them in the comments below. The piece is very, very long, so we can only quote selected excerpts, but it's important to give Logan Wright the space to unpack his ideas. The piece also cites a lot of research and other reports, and so I've included many of the references in the description below, so you can reference those as well. If you get some value from today's episode, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you think someone else will get some value from it, it's also a big help if you can share and subscribe. Okay, here we go. We quote selected excerpts of the piece directly. Nothing in economic development is certain, but China's economy has probably already peaked in size as a proportion of the global economy, reaching the peak in 2021. China now faces a structural economic slowdown as the financial system constrains economic growth rather than facilitating it. These economic pressures are directly linked to the end of an unprecedented credit and investment expansion during the previous decade. The resulting credit crunch has produced a collapse in property investment and slower local government infrastructure investment. Moreover, GDP growth has almost certainly been overstated in the official data both in 2022 and in 2023. The costs of years of low-return investments now prevent Beijing from redirecting the financial system, making it difficult to unleash improvements in efficiency or so-called new quality productive forces. However, nothing about Beijing's behavior in response to the structural slowdown is inevitable, as China's leaders can adjust their economic objectives and potentially ease tensions with the rest of the world by publicly acknowledging a slower growth trajectory. The phrase peak China is having a moment in discussions of the global economy, even though the phrase is usually accompanied by a question mark to indicate skepticism about the premise. The debate over whether China is peaking typically focuses on Beijing's perceived power and international influence, and whether China's nascent decline or continued ascendance will change Beijing's behavior and policy making. At the foundation of this discussion, however, are the fundamentals of China's economic performance and the prospects for China's future economic growth. The decline of China's economy over the past 3 years, linked to the collapse of the property sector and weakness in local government infrastructure investment, has raised new questions about whether a return to the previous growth rates is possible or whether China is facing a structural economic slowdown. The question is not only significant in foreign conversations, but within China as well. In Chinese social media discussions, the phrase garbage time of history has begun to circulate surrounding China's current economic prospects, to the consternation of the domestic censors. This article makes 3 arguments related to this debate. First, while nothing in economic development is certain, as a proportion of the global economy, China's economy probably peaked in 2021. Second, nothing about Beijing's behavior in response to China's structural economic slowdown is inevitable. Beijing's own economic objectives and expectations about China's trajectory are the most important influences on its policy making, and these goals can change. Third, if China's economic slowdown continues, Beijing can ease tensions with the rest of the world by publicly acknowledging such trends. China's current expectations about its own economic growth to achieve socialist modernization by 2035 a goal that is widely interpreted by Chinese officials to mean a doubling of the gross domestic product, GDP, from 2020 levels to that date are unrealistic. Beijing's tendency to engage in gradualism may prevent near-term downgrades of such economic goals. However, a China that is no longer trying to overtake the United States economically, or Chinese leaders who realize that surpassing the US is highly improbable, can refocus its development objectives on slower but more sustainable consumption-driven growth, while reducing trade frictions with the rest of the world. China's politics currently prevent these expectations from shifting, but the party can always redefine the country's economic goals. Similarly, Western policymakers who define the economic challenge from China as fundamental, based on a flawed view of China's economic prospects, ironically limit their options in responding to Beijing's policy choices and risk overshooting with restrictions that end up blowing back on their own economies. Peaking and proposed measurement. Peaking is a relative concept. For China to peak, its economy must be growing and then declining in importance and influence compared to other economies. China's absolute pace of real GDP growth has slowed since reaching 14% in 2007, but since then China has still grown faster than the rest of the world. In addressing whether or not China is peaking economically, this article argues the relevant metric should be China's importance within the global economy as a whole, not a narrow comparison to the United States, the world's largest economy in GDP terms at $27.3 trillion in 2023. Figure 1 shows the simplest representation of trends in that metric, with China's economy rising from 3.6% of global GDP in 2000 to 18.3% in 2021, before dropping to 16.9% in global GDP in 2023, at $17.8 trillion US. The chart also highlights two potential future paths for China's economy: the trajectory of the US economy, which has averaged 26.2% of the world over the past 4 decades, and that of Japan, which rose from 4% of global GDP in 1960 to a peak of 18% in 1994, before dropping all the way back down to 4% in 2023. Notably, these measures are in US dollar terms. Changes in exchange rates and relative prices among economies can influence these comparisons. In addition, China's exchange rate is not a market-determined price, but instead it is actively managed by the central bank as a policy instrument. For several years after the Asian financial crisis, China's central bank intervened in order to keep the currency weaker against the dollar and other currencies, which improved China's export competitiveness. Since the start of capital outflows from China in 2015, the central bank has mostly pushed in the other direction, strengthening the exchange rate in order to prevent expectations of further currency depreciation from catalyzing outflows and placing pressures on the domestic financial system. In the future, China's currency is likely to weaken, given the need to manage pressures from domestic debt by reducing Chinese interest rates. All else being equal, lower interest rates will contribute to capital outflows from Chinese households and corporations and will likely lead to a depreciation of the yuan. As of June 2024, China has the world's largest money supply of domestic currency issued in RMB, measured at $42 trillion US dollars in US dollar terms, and it continues expanding by around 3 to 4 trillion in new RMB created every year, generating powerful incentives for Chinese households and corporations to diversify into foreign assets. Capital controls prevent this outflow from occurring all at once, but most people can still move their funds abroad over time, producing a gradual outflow and depreciation pressures on the currency. Thus, using market exchange rates and China's GDP in US dollar terms is more important than analyzing the question of whether China is peaking in global economic influence, as the exchange rate itself is a measure of China's policy capacity. Purchasing Power Parity, PPP, is a different type of adjustment used to compare price levels across economies in order to assess an economy's size. Using most PPP-related measurements, China has already overtaken the US economy in GDP terms. In determining China's growing global economic influence, however, PPP adjustments are less useful for the following reasons. 1. PPP adjustments are generally used to compare emerging economies with developed economies rather than to assess which major economy is rising or falling in global influence. PPP adjustments are difficult to measure over time as they require constant updates to various prices to determine the relevant conversion factors for cross-country comparisons. Analyses of cross-border financial flows or trade flows where exchange rates are important, prices are less suited to PPP-based comparisons. Even if China's currency has greater purchasing power because some goods are cheaper in China's economy than they are in the United States, for example, justifying an adjustment in the size of China's economy in PPP terms, China's market for these products would not be attractive to US investors who would measure their returns in US dollars. Similarly, China's influence in global markets for commodities or consumer goods would be measured in terms of China's firms' purchasing power relative to that of other consumers, measured in the same terms, usually in US dollars. The case that China's economy is peaked. The case that China's economy has peaked as a share of the global economy rests upon two arguments. First, the decline in China's economic growth is structural in nature rather than cyclical. Second, while Beijing has some capacity to improve the country's long-term economic trajectory through policy changes, political and financial constraints prevent Beijing from pursuing these necessary reforms. The headwinds confronting China's economy are legion, and the arguments for a structural slowdown in China have been litigated thoroughly during the past 2 years. Demographic pressures are obvious, as China's total population began declining in 2022, and the working-age population has been declining since 2013. There are no available examples of any other economy with a declining working-age population growing at faster than 3% over any 5-year period once the labor force has declined, in part because countries with declining working-age populations are rare. The external economic environment for China is now far less accommodative than it was in the past, with multinational businesses actively de-risking and reducing their reliance upon China within global manufacturing supply chains and as a driver of consumer demand. Furthermore, China's new development strategy requires expanding overseas market share in critical industries, which is already generating additional tensions with its trading partners. However, the primary reason that China's economic slowdown is structural in nature is one that Beijing acknowledges. The credit and investment-led growth model has reached a dead end. The case that China's economy faces a long-term slowdown led by investment activity can be simply stated as 4 propositions. 1. China was an investment-led economy during the past 2 decades, with a higher rate of investment growth than any other peer country in recent history. Gross fixed capital formation was still officially 42% of GDP in 2023. 2. The primary drivers of the investment growth during the past 2 decades were property construction and infrastructure investment. Both depended heavily upon steady flows of credit from the financial system. 3. Both property and local government infrastructure investment have now declined sharply and will not recover to their previous levels, as China's financial system cannot continue financing investment at the same rate as it did in the past. 4. Nothing else has replaced these sectors as meaningful drivers of growth, nor is there anything likely to do so given the constraints of China's financial system. The financial system now constrains China's growth. It is impossible to separate the rapid growth of China's economy since the global financial crisis in 2008 with the astronomical growth of China's financial system. China saw the largest single-country credit expansion in over a century, adding $24 trillion in new assets over the 8 years from 2008 through 2016, around 1/3 of global GDP. Banking system assets now total $59 trillion as of June 2024, over 3 times the size of China's economy and around 56% of global GDP. In comparison, China's real GDP grew by $6.1 trillion between 2008 through 2016 and a further $7.1 trillion between 2016 and 2023. China has by far the largest single-country banking system in the world in terms of assets. US banks hold around $23.4 trillion in assets, but the US has a far more diversified financial system than China. That volume of lending by Chinese banks was extended primarily on the basis of government guarantees rather than the potential financial returns of the underlying investments. As a result, this credit expansion generated significant numbers of loans that may have been made to safe state-owned companies, but they constantly require loan rollovers and extensions, A financial system this large and this impaired can no longer guarantee the same pace of credit and investment growth as it did in the past. Banks are constrained in terms of their capital levels, which depend upon continued profits, and this impacts asset growth. Bank profit margins and credit growth in China have already slowed significantly. China's overall credit growth averaged 18% from 2007 to 2016. Its slowdown in credit growth began in earnest with the deleveraging campaign from 2016 through 2018. And since then, credit growth has averaged just 9%. Banks' average net investment margins on lending have fallen from 2.77% in 2012 to 1.54% in the first quarter of 2024, according to data from China's banking regulator. During the past 3 years, the effects of cutting credit growth in half have materialized in the form of a collapse in property investment, a slowdown in local government investment, and rising local government fiscal pressures. Currently, as of June 2024, the pace of credit growth measured via total social financing is only 8.1%. Total bank asset growth is only 6.5%, monetary growth, M2, is 6.2%, and bank assets, excluding government bond purchases, are rising by only 5.2%. All of these figures are at or approaching all-time lows. To think about the long-term growth of China's economy without thinking about the long-term development and growth rates of China's financial system. A financial system can only grow at rates widely disconnected from the real economy it is financing if it is deepening or expanding access to financial services, or if new credit risks are being generated. Usually these two developments go hand in hand. When the inevitable correction in credit occurs, bad loans are written off, lending standards are tightened, asset prices fall, and defaults and bankruptcies emerge. Then the financial system's growth will slow relative to the real economy. This process is already underway in China. Beijing is resisting these developments as they are politically and economically painful. But just because the Chinese authorities are resisting the slowdown, they still cannot maintain the same pace of credit growth as they did in the past. The slowdown in investment growth is linked to the slowdown in credit, and in an economy where gross fiscal capital formation still represents 42% of GDP, weakening investment growth has a significant impact on the country's overall long-term economic growth. The challenges of redirecting the financial system. The most conventional answer to this argument is that China can offset the decline in overall investment growth by accelerating productivity growth and lending to more effective sectors of the economy rather than legacy industries. Discussion of the new quality productive forces in China's economy acknowledge the need for faster productivity growth in dealing with limited resources. China's TFP growth over the past decade is the subject of extensive economic debates, but most analysts place it close to the International Monetary Fund's estimated level of 0.7%, which the fund expects to continue to decline. State-directed financial systems do not change patterns of credit allocation on a dime. As overall credit growth slows, directing credit to more productive sectors requires cutting off state-owned borrowers who had previously relied on the banking system to continue operating. China's financial system is extremely large, but it is also generally unprofitable, thus creating problems for cleaning up the bank and redirecting credit flows toward more productive uses. Local government borrowing still represents around 1/3 of the total activity and assets of the banking system. There are few signs that the financial system has shifted its lending patterns. This is primarily because the authorities fear of the political consequences of doing so, in the form of defaults, bankruptcies, and unemployment. A detailed examination of the local government special revenue bond (SRB) prospects documents in 8 provinces in 2021 and 2022, representing 38% of the total SRBs issued in those years, reveals that only 3% of the proceeds were channeled to China's new infrastructure priorities, such as data centers, green technologies, and artificial intelligence. Property-related projects absorbed about 5 times the volume of local government relative to Beijing's stated industrial policy priorities, even when Beijing was de-emphasizing support for the property sector. The net result is that the financial system has become less efficient in generating growth over time, and more of the declining flow of new credit is channeled into less productive uses. Local governments are approaching the point of default in order to repay banks so that the banks can continue to lend to local governments and their infrastructure investments can continue. Local governments are now facing the consequences of 5 years of excessive borrowing and high interest payments, with local government financing vehicles often paying commercial interest rates, averaging 5.4% according to our surveys of local government financing vehicle financial reports, to complete public works projects that usually provide returns averaging just over 1%. China's fiscal constraints require a far more extensive discussion, but they are also directly linked to the slowdown in investment-led growth and credit growth. Tax and non-tax revenues have fallen from 22.1% of GDP in 2015 to just over 16% so far this year, as the property sector has caused land sales revenue to decline. Local governments cannot maintain the same pace of spending growth. This not only prevents the use of fiscal policy as a tool to stimulate the economy, but also reduces Beijing's capacity to use the declining fiscal resources to restructure the financial system. There are potential future drivers for China's economic growth, but by necessity, they must be far less credit-intensive than the model China has used during the past 2 decades. Alternative growth models and their limitations. Beijing has long been aware that the credit and investment-led growth model would end at some point. The authorities have taken active steps to limit the growth of the property sector for years. And starting early in his 3rd term, Xi Jinping promoted the concept of common prosperity as a goal for China's economic development, implying a clear shift from the existing patterns of growth. The problem for Beijing is that the alternative growth drivers imply much slower economic growth in the future, even if they are more sustainable than merely continuing to accumulate debt. Advanced manufacturing-led growth. Beijing has offered 2 paths as potential answers to China's ongoing slowdown. The approach generated the most attention is the renewed emphasis on industrial investment in the advanced manufacturing industries, particularly the so-called new threes of electric vehicles, solar cells, and lithium-ion batteries. This is sometimes framed alongside China's concept of dual circulation and its push for greater self-sufficiency, insulating the economy from Western sanctions and export controls on key technologies. The primary problem with this strategy is simply mathematical. None of these industries alone or in combination are likely to offset the impact of the declining property or infrastructure construction, which at their peak together represented around 40% of China's economy. Investment in these industries will certainly expand, and they will have greater upstream and downstream effects on the economy. But in the aggregate, the new 3 will still remain far smaller relative to the size of China's economy than the property and local government infrastructure spending. More importantly, however, it is very difficult to grow relative to the rest of the world while pursuing a manufacturing-led growth strategy. As Michael Pettis points out, if investment is powering China's economy, for China's economy to grow faster than the rest of the world, China's investment growth will need to continue to expand relative to global investment. China already represents an estimated 28% of global investment and only 12% of global consumption. That investment-led relative growth can only occur if other countries voluntarily reduce their own investment activity or if they are driven out of business by Chinese investments and gains in market share. In fact, with the de-risking and diversification push away from China-centric supply chains, the opposite is occurring around the world, with new investments underway. Moreover, if manufacturing is the most important driver of growth relative to domestic consumption, this intrinsically implies external demand from the rest of the world will be stronger than domestic demand. The only alternative model to grow faster than the rest of the world while pursuing manufacturing-led growth is to consistently expand market share in global exports, which is extremely difficult as China is already the world's largest exporter. Its push to expand exports further is already generating trade defenses in both the developed and emerging economies amidst growing global warnings about China's overcapacity. A manufacturing-led growth strategy will not only require maintaining China's current investment growth rates, already under pressure from falling credit, but also overcoming significant trade tensions. Consumption-led growth and its limits. The second alternative is for Beijing to finally take more decisive actions to rebalance China's economy towards domestic consumption and away from investment and exports. This has been an explicit goal of China's leadership ever since the 2004 Central Economic Work Conference, yet imbalances have persisted. In a sense, the rebalancing of the economy finally began in 2022 and 2023 at much slower rates of overall GDP growth, given the collapse of the property sector as consumption has continued growing while investment has declined. There are obvious reasons why the Chinese economy cannot quickly rebalance away from investment and exports while maintaining the same rates of economic growth. Consumption growth is slower and remains limited by income growth and the level of income inequality, as wealthier households consume a smaller proportion of their incomes. Data from Gandi's China Household Finance survey consistently show that the wealthiest 10% of Chinese households hold around 60 to 65% of overall savings. Data from China's official household survey suggests that even if the entire rural population of China were suddenly to cut its savings rates in half, this would only result in 0.6% of GDP in additional annual spending. Constraints on rebalancing are more fundamental, and they are linked to the level of household income and the distribution of that income. Any meaningful effort to rebalance China's economy will require structural reforms of the fiscal system. Household income as a proportion of GDP is low, at only 61% of the economy, according to China's flow and funds data. Fiscal policy does not prioritize transfer payments to households to improve incomes, and it does very little to change the unequal distribution of wealth. It is unreasonable to expect consumption growth to dramatically accelerate from its current pace without significant transfers of wealth from government to households. At the current pace, consumption growth has only accounted for an average of 2.4 percentage points of GDP growth over the past 7 years, even according to the official data. Corrected for distortions, the picture is likely worse. In 2024, so far consumption growth is slowing further, with official retail sales raising from about 3.7%, a pace likely this year to produce only around 1.5 percentage points of GDP. Japan's balance sheet recession and property bubble. Performance of the Japanese economy is most frequently compared to China's current economic performance. Last year, the journal, The International Economy, solicited short opinions from over 20 economists and analysts comparing China's current position to that of Japan. The similarities are obvious, as China also struggled with a bubble economy focused on real estate accompanied by demographic headwinds. As the bubble burst, the property values declined, Japan's savings rate together with investment continued to drop, and monetary policy became increasingly inefficient as corporate credit demand was weak, even though interest rates were near zero. This created what Richard Koo labeled a balance sheet recession, caused by the need to pay down corporate debt over time to cover losses from declines in asset prices. Koo's argument is that under these conditions, only fiscal policy could restore aggregate demand, and eventually, in the late 1990s, the Japanese authorities opened the fiscal taps to stabilize the economy. Nonetheless, the experience of Japan's lost decade is a scenario Beijing hopes to avoid, given the resultant financial instability in Japan in the late 1990s and the decline in Japan's global economic weight since the mid-1990s. Many Chinese analysts have examined Koo's arguments and are already using the phrase balance sheet recession to describe China's economic problems, particularly related to the property sector. However, there are two significant differences between China's current economic headwinds and those in Japan. First, China can still use monetary policy to generate credit demand. It is its fiscal policy that is more constrained under the current system. Beijing is reluctant to cut interest rates further because of the pressure it would place upon bank profitability, on the continued pace of the asset and investment growth, and on the exchange rate via capital outflows. Second, the weakness in investment in China is not being generated by balance sheets or the need to pay down debt rather than to invest. The slowdown is occurring primarily because the financial system cannot expand at its previous rates to generate investment. Local governments would probably still invest more if they had the funds available and Beijing's limits on debt growth were eased. The similarity to Japan's circumstances are significant as well. Given the rapid decline in birth rates in recent years, China's demographic pressures may end up worse than those in Japan. Both China and Japan suffer from impaired or zombie financial institutions that are insolvent but not illiquid, and so they continue to throw more good money to bad projects rather than being formally restructured. China currently appears to be facing a similar version of Japan's liquidity trap, in which more liquidity in the banking system is channeled into financial assets rather than into new lending or economic activity. But the most significant threat to China would be a repeat of Japan's persistent deflationary pressure, reducing incentives for companies to invest and grow and adding to debt servicing costs over time. The acute pressures in China's financial system make this a highly relevant problem, as China's nominal growth rates have continued slowing in recent years, averaging only 4.5%, even in the official data since the end of 2021. And property prices have also trended sharply lower since 2021. Without stronger credit growth, which the banking system cannot generate in its current state, or much stronger household consumption growth, it seems it will be difficult to escape Japan-style deflationary pressures. Shifting the narrative. The intellectual bubble surrounding China's economy will take longer to burst than the actual bubbles in property and local debt. We actively searched for the first published use of the phrase lost decade in association with Japan's economy, and the first reference we could find was in July 1998. Almost 9 years after the peak of Japan's equity market and long after the strains in the real estate market were evident. A commentary from Brick Lenzie and Aaron Lucas containing that reference could be used almost word for word to describe the current discussion on China's economy, simply by replacing Japan with China. Today, the verdict is in. The revisionists were dead wrong, both in their assessment of the Japanese threat and in their recommendations for US policy. Japan has not attained worldwide dominance. On the contrary, it has suffered a lost decade of economic stagnation. The Japan Inc. model has not eclipsed Western-style capitalism. Instead, there is an emerging consensus on both sides of the Pacific that the Japanese model has failed. Meanwhile, the United States, far from declining, is enjoying record-setting prosperity because it largely ignored the revisionists' advice. Japan's problems are now obvious. To revive its fortunes, it must move to a system under which capital is allocated, not according to established relationships or government policy, but in response to clear and undistorted market signals. In sum, Japan needs to abandon the very elements of its system that the revisionists signaled out as its greatest strengths. Similarly, commentaries discussing China's structural slowdown are becoming more frequent, but they remain outside of mainstream opinion, which points to only a modest slowdown in Chinese growth. Ironically, were Beijing to publicly acknowledge China's economic decline rather than project its artificial sense of stability, it would actually smooth the path for China to grow its economy at a faster rate over the next decade. China's leaders have a political problem in that they frame their economic objectives in a fashion that inherently conflicts with those of the rest of the world. Some members of the Politburo may realize this, but such a recognition is not apparent in official documents, such as the 2024 Third Plenum Resolution. Manufacturing-led growth without stimulating domestic demand implies that China can grow only by taking market share from other countries. It is bound to generate trade defenses in response. Politically generated growth targets that are focused on global supremacy at the expense of sustainable domestic demand-led economic growth and spending by Chinese consumers naturally raise questions about the potential priorities of China's leaders should the country actually become a dominant global economic power. Conversely, a shift in public messaging about the need for domestic rather than external demand may reduce trade conflicts and international tensions, and would actually open up more possibilities for Beijing to pursue industrial policy objectives in next tech industries. More realistic macroeconomic data would help. Beijing is calibrating policies as well. Similarly, the rest of the world, including the United States, can more effectively compete with China by framing the economic challenge differently. A China that has peaked economically is not a challenge to the survivability of liberal and market-oriented economic systems. Instead, China represents a set of narrower but important risks that emerge from China's economic slowdown, including spillovers from systemic overcapacity and financial excess. Other significant risks from China are political or military in nature, but they should be grounded in an understanding that China's economy is fading rather than rising in global influence. Disaggregating political and military risks from China's economic challenge offers more options to limit those threats, using narrower measures with fewer economic spillovers and, consequently, less domestic political resistance. China's economy peaking in global influence also offers Beijing a new opportunity to realistically redefine its goals and to become less confrontational with the rest of the world's economic and political interests. But we are under no illusions that such a redefinition is probable. If these views are read by China's leaders, their likely response would be to simply reject the premise in its entirety that China has peaked and to dismiss it as an argument of just one more Western analyst downplaying China's clear record of past policy successes based on ulterior motives. But there are no simple solutions for Beijing's plight. Economic activity in the sum of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Growth from investment has already collapsed. Growth from consumption is already slowing. Growth from government spending is exhausted by local debt burdens. Growth from net exports is facing political resistance. The exchange rate is under pressure to depreciate. For China's economic trajectory to reverse course and grow again relative to the rest of the world, several of these basic premises must change. Ironically, Beijing will have more success changing China's current economic predicament by publicly acknowledging it rather than by clinging to a politically motivated narrative that China's economy cannot fulfill. Here ends the direct quote of a very long but important piece. I hope you enjoyed it and got some value from this. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to like. Sharing and subscribing is also a big help too. Please let me know what you thought of the episode in the comments below. Have a wonderful Sunday, and I will see you back for regular episodes tomorrow.